Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Chapter 13, the Great War, and specifically we're going to look at Section 13.3. It's called a global conflict. Now in this section we're going to talk how the war spread to the outer reaches of Europe, parts of the Ottoman Empire, what happened in Russia, and also partly what happened in the United States. So if you take a look at this map, you can see the Central Powers are in the middle. These are the military alliances that they're based off. Now we've learned that Italy actually doesn't fight with the Central Powers; they end up fighting with the Allies. And we've also learned that the Ottoman Empire down here in the corner, that's one of the countries that becomes allies with Germany and Austria. And so it's important just to keep in mind the geography. You have the United Kingdom and France on the western front of Germany, and you have Russia and the Ottoman Empire towards the eastern front for both Germany and Austria-Hungary. So as we go through the guided reading, this guided reading is set up as a timeline. And there's events that happen, and then there's questions that come from those events. So as you can see on your guided reading, the first event that's mentioned in the timeline is from February 1915, and that's from the Gallipoli campaign that starts at this time. Now you can take a look at this map that I have over here. This is the Ottoman Empire, and this Bosporus right here is kind of like the border between Asia and Europe. And so everything over here is Europe. You can see here is Greece, and everything over here is Asia. But the Ottomans still have territory in this part of the world. And actually, this city, Constantinople, is actually partly both in Asia and Europe. And the area that we're going to talk about, Gallipoli, is actually this peninsula down here. We've magnified it a little bit so you can see a little bit better what area we're talking about here. And the Dardanelles, this narrow waterway here, which is crucially important for Russia because ships need to get through here to come up into the Black Sea as they go through the Bosphorus in order for Russia to get supplies. So what was the purpose of the Gallipoli campaign? Well, first of all, the Allies wanted to secure a supply line to Russia. France and England wanted to be able to ship supplies to Russia. Remember, Russia wasn't nearly as industrialized as the other countries, and they couldn't produce products from clothes to boots to rifles to weapons to ammunition as fast as the other countries. So if they were going to be a force to be reckoned with to fight with Germany and Austria on the eastern front, the Allies were going to have to get them supplies. Now, in order for to get those supplies up there, the Allies had to fight through one of Germany and Austria's allies, the Central Powers of the Ottoman Empire. And so in order to defeat the Ottomans, the Allies came up with a plan. First, they needed to secure the Dardanelles, which again is this narrow strip of water used for transport. Right? That was the gateway to the Ottomans' capital of Constantinople, as you can see in the map above. And so their aim was to take out the Dardanelles first, cover that by the Gallipoli campaign. Now, it didn't work. They failed. The English attacked with several of their allies in several different ways. They lost a lot of soldiers, and eventually they had to retreat and back off because it wasn't working. And in other words, that means that the Allies were never able to secure the sea area, the sea passage, to get supplies to Russia. That's going to have strong effects on Russia later in the war. So a couple other events that happened before the next question on your guided reading is in January 1917, Germany announces a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Remember, that means that they will shoot any ship that they suspect of sending supplies to their ally Great Britain. The United States was sending a lot of supplies, sometimes disguised in ships that weren't set up to be sending military supplies. And so Germany says, we're going to destroy any of these ships with our submarines. Another thing that happened was in February 1917, the British intercepted what's known as the Zimmermann telegram or the Zimmermann note. And this note basically was a message from the German government to the Mexican government that if Mexico helped to attack the United States and join on the German side of the war, that Germany would then in turn help Mexico recover territory it had lost to the United States decades and decades ago. We're talking about California, New Mexico, Nevada area. The Mexicans didn't really want to have much to do with this. In fact, they told the Americans that they received this note, but the British also intercepted it, which kind of exposed the Germans for what they were. And a little bit later, shortly after that, around April 1917 is when the United States actually enters the war. So the question is, why did the United States enter the war? And those events help to illustrate it. The Americans were mad. They were outraged at Germany. They didn't want Germany to either A, shoot down the ships that had American citizens on them with their unrestricted submarine warfare. They also didn't like the idea of Germany trying to make deals with the Americans' neighbors to attack American lands. And so they were pretty outraged and upset at Germany. Another reason the Allies entered the war, particularly on the side that they did, on the Allies' side with the English and the French, is because they had traditional bonds between the Americans and the English. They have strong economic ties. They speak the same language. They're often said to have a very similar culture. And so straight from the get-go, the Americans were kind of supplying the English, and it was inevitable if they were going to join the war that that's the side that they would be on. And finally, reports of German war atrocities are another reason the United States entered the war. Not only were they Germans shooting down ships, but they were also attacking civilians throughout Belgium during their invasion. And as you can see from this poster all the way on the left side, the propaganda depicted Germany as a brute, as a savage, attacking and harming people, and that was a recruitment tool to get people into the U.S. Army to fight in the war. That other poster there with Uncle Sam pointing, that's a pretty famous poster. You may have seen that before, but that first came about in World War I, and that's often reused in many different forms and fashions. Okay, so the next event is in November 17. This is when Vladimir Lenin seizes power in Russia. And you can see Vladimir Lenin standing at that kind of pulpit stand that he has there, talking to the Russian people. There was a lot of things going on in Russia during the war. And so the question comes, how and why did the Tsar's government collapse? And that's how Lenin eventually seized powers, from the collapse of the previous Tsar's regime. So there's a couple things that come into play here. First of all, there's civil unrest due to wartime shortages. Russia, as we said, isn't able to get supplies from their allies. They're running short on a lot of things, including food. People don't have enough to eat. They don't have supplies. Another thing they're really short on is fuel. They don't have fuel for their machines, and so their factories can't always work great either. So there's a lot of problems with the public because the government isn't meeting the needs and because they're short on these supplies. Another problem is that there was a refusal of the Russian army to continue fighting. The Russian soldiers were being sent to the front without the supplies they needed, particularly guns and ammunition, but also coats and blankets and boots. They were basically being sent to the front lines with very little supplies, and so there was a bit of a mutiny there. The Russian soldiers said, "We're not doing this anymore." And finally, after some time, when the Russian army said, "We're not fighting anymore," the Tsar Nicholas abdicates. Now, abdicate is a fancy word for kings or monarchs or emperors. It means they stop being the king or the emperor. So Nicholas basically resigned from being the Tsar. And then shortly after that, there's a communist revolution. At first, there's a government that comes in March. They say, hey, we're going to continue fighting the war because this is a just cause. But shortly after that, the communists come and take control in November, and Lenin immediately pulls Russia out of the war and signs a ceasefire and treaty with the Germans. So in March 1918, this treaty comes into effect. It's called the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. Germany and Russia sign it together. You can see on this map, Russia definitely loses territory. And so this is kind of a major occurrence in the war because one of the hugest powers is suddenly out. Right? So the question is, what did the treaty accomplish? Well, first of all, it ended war and fighting between Germany and Russia. They were no longer fighting. This was really good for Germany because now their two-front war had closed to a one-front war. They're only fighting to their west. They can leave minimal troops here, and they can send more to the west. They also gained some territories, you can tell from that picture there. And that is due to the fact that Russia is saying we need to get out of this war. We're done. We can't fight anymore. We don't have the troops. This is weighing way too hard on our people. And so because of that, Germany knows Russia's in a tough spot. They lean on Russia, and Russia gives up this whole section of land that you see here. It may not look very big on the map, but that's a huge area. You can look at the widest part of that area, something around 600 miles. And so that's a lot of land to give up. Later, Russia's going to want that back. July 1918, another section of your timeline is the Allies and Germans fight the Second Battle of the Marne. What was the significance of this battle? That's the question. Now, Germany actually did quite well at the start of this battle. They advanced deep into the Allies' territory, further and further into France, and they actually got quite close to Paris once again. They were moving very rapidly, and you can see in that upper picture in the upper left, those are actually British tanks that have been taken over by Germans. You can see on one of those tanks in the front, there's the German military cross that a lot of Germans had on their uniforms. However, Germans were starting to run low on supplies, they were running low on men, and they were exhausted. So eventually they're repelled back and defeated, and it showed the Allies how tired and how war-weary Germany really was. This is also significant because this is the first major battle where millions of Americans are taking place. They're fighting in this battle. And this is a huge game changer for the war because suddenly you have this huge country with huge amounts of supplies, fresh men who haven't been stuck in the trenches for years, and now they're ready to fight and to aid the Allies. That really doesn't look good for Germany at that point. Because of this battle, the Germans made a lot of success in the beginning. They gained a lot of ground, but then they started to get pushed back by the Allies. So the Allies actually begin to come up on German territory, right? And this is also the time when the Central Powers begin to crumble. The Austrians give up. There's a revolution there. They lose their emperor. The Ottomans give up. Their empire disintegrates. And this is when Germany is pretty much left with no allies. November 1918 is when World War I officially ends, and the question is, what events signaled the final defeat of the Central Powers? And there's a list of things that happened here. First of all, the surrender of the Bulgarians and the Ottoman Turks. The Bulgarians are another party that came to the war to fight with the Central Powers. They have to surrender. The Ottomans have to surrender. There's a revolution in Austria-Hungary, kind of overthrowing the emperor and kind of breaking up that whole empire into different ethnic groups that would later become different countries. And then finally, there's also a mutiny in Germany, particularly in the German Navy. Some of the German sailors and Navy officers won't go out and fight this large battle with the British. And that really shames the Kaiser. That's a picture of him there, Kaiser Wilhelm II. And it's eventually forced upon him to have to abdicate, to have to resign as the leader. And then shortly after, Germany agrees to a ceasefire. And shortly after that, a little bit time after that, is when we have the Treaty of Versailles that will resolve the end of the war. There's a list of our sources that I use today for the pictures. Everything else comes right out of your textbook. And thanks for listening, guys, and I'll see you in class soon.